Okay,
Oh,
so
there's our
now we're
warning.
being recorded, and I will have the audio file here.
And it looks like I'm going to open up a chat window here too, so we can see questions from folks, or I'll look
Yes.
for questions from the group that's
Yep.
here.
Yep. That would
Tad,
be good. Let's
should we
get
just get
rolling.
started here?
Yeah.
All
Why
right,
don't we?
let's roll. Well, welcome everyone. It's 10 o'clock here in Chamonix, so I guess that's why I wanted to get started. I want to see how long it lasts, and I'm fighting a cold, which thankfully was just that and not more. I guess we should talk a little bit about Chris, and it's a little sort of one way. Everyone, feel free to chat in the chat box here. I mean, we all sort of know each other. A few names I don't know. And Tad, I'm super psyched you're here to talk about your era and just give overall Randolph context to some of this. I hope you've all had a chance to download the article, the homework assignment. But I got really interested in Chris when I first started coming to Randolph, because everyone would talk about I was going out for trail runs and people would say, Chris, Chris, Goetze did this and Chris did that. And I grew curious, and I was able to cross paths with Klaus a little bit when I first arrived. And, Chris was, when I arrived in Randolph, really kind of legendary, yet I didn't really know who he was. And as time went on, I started to sort of piece stories together. And in large part, we're having this conversation because of his father's article, Klaus's article in the 1950, December 1958 Appalachia Journal, which is called Far and Fast. And that article, which of course is now something like 60 plus years old, is still referenced today by trail runners in the White Mountains. And it was like, is touchstone the right word? It was something that I always kept a copy of handy and would refer to and look to for times.
Yeah.
And I think there are two or three reasons why Chris is of interest to me. First was, as I grew to learn more about him, and I always really wanted to have a chance to really dig into his story, which I was able to do with this article in Trail Runner. One is his incredible records, which, were way, way ahead of his time nationally, as far as I can tell. The other, of course, is all of his Randolph connections that we all know. And then I think his ethics were really interesting, very, very thoughtful, and a very, very, I don't want to say ahead of his time, maybe that's not quite right, but like very good wilderness ethics that I felt attached to also. So
Yeah.
he seemed very important to me, even though we never crossed paths, and he
And
passed
very
away a
unusual
long
for
time.
his very unusual for
Yeah.
his time.
So I was going to say, Tad, I mean, you knew Chris, I guess, and crossed paths a bit.
A
What
bit.
were you? What was your take on him? And then we can talk
I
about some of
didn't.
his records and stuff.
Yeah, I didn't know him at all well. He was let's see how much older. He was about 11 years older than me. And I did meet him, but he was not somebody that I knew. I knew Klaus very well. Klaus was sort of the, the the hub or the axle of the Randolph Mountain Club during the years that I was on trail crew and in the huts. And so, I would hear the stories recounted by him, and then I was aware of his records from very early on because of that. I think it's let's back up even a little bit further to talk about some of the very earliest um, speed hiking uh, escapades in the White Mountains. And I think one of the things to point out is that while Chris is, I think, possibly unique, um, in part because we know so much about him, because his father kept track of what he did. But there were a lot of other people, or not a lot, but there were other people out there that we know nothing about who are doing this. The few that we do know about, people like Burt Malcolm, um, or this fellow that I just learned about the last couple of days, MacPhail, who was in the huts in the early 60s. Uh, there were other people doing this, but they didn't talk about it. It wasn't something that was a big goal. There wasn't, of course, the internet to pass information back and forth. But you can go back to the, you can go back. Well, I think it's really interesting to go back to Burt Malcolm, who was the one who, he wasn't the very first person to treat the series of AMC huts as a goal to walk from one hut to the other, but I think he was the second person to do it in the 30s. And he had the record that was the one for Chris to beat. And that, Doug, you can fill in on that. But
Yeah.
Chris was a very conscientious, focused person. You certainly see that in everything that you read about him. That carried over into his science as well. He was a type that I am familiar with in science, who has a very unusual ability to stay latched on to a topic. One of the other things that I heard about him is that he was able to fall asleep almost instantly. If people were with him on a group, they were hiking or something, if they stopped, he could just lean against a tree and fall asleep for just a couple of moments. All kinds of little oddball stories like that about him. But yeah, he really was unusual. He was one of these people that does not move a some field of expertise forward incrementally. He just steps into a completely new realm. And I think that your take on him as possibly the first trail runner is because he was the one that I think first made the step from fast walking to running.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, Tad, hearing you talk about him as kind of a revolutionary figure, maybe in his work, because I definitely see him in that role in the trail running world. And when you look at, I mean, there are probably 8 or 10 reasons why. I'm just going to highlight some of them. And actually, when you mentioned falling asleep very quickly, frankly, that's a skill that ultra runners acquire. If they're doing like more than a 24-hour run, you actually, and they've done studies on this, you go quickly into REM sleep. So you kind of reverse the normal sleep habits, and I've come to understand that. So it's interesting he had that as well. By the way, it was Alex MacPhail, and I have to put an asterisk next to some of his records. Well, we can perhaps talk about that later, but they've been called into question, 1 or 2 of them. But there was no doubt that Alex was very fast. He was the first to use the word run in an article about Chris, and he put it in quotes. And so in a sense that's a transition. But, in the course of writing this article, I talked to, Brian Underhill out your way, Tad, well, in Randolph now, out in Colorado. And he talked about some of the things, and a bunch of people actually talked about this, that Chris did that were very different. He sort of blew up the paradigm of fast hiking in the mountains and being trampers. And, I had to go back to my own article and look at some of the notes. It's kind of pathetic. I've already forgotten a lot of this, but he really thought about pacing in a way that ultra runners think about pacing, which is setting yourself up for a long, long, long period of time and being very cognizant of that. He gave a lot of thought to nutrition. It might not be the advice we use today. Chris seemed to like a lot of protein, a lot of meat cooked for him on the trail. But, nutrition is a constant topic for people doing these feats nowadays. He ran downhill very fast, and Brian described a technique he used. And, I mean, over here, running downhill is a technical skill that you acquire.
Yeah.
And I think in Randolph, we all sort of picked it up one way or another also, but he gave that really conscious thought. He used sneakers on the uphills. Now we're all running in sneakers. Before it seems like very few people, maybe if any, were doing that.
Yeah.
And so we even have that anecdote from Lydia Cross of her helping Chris change from boots to sneakers, and that's really, in my mind, that sticks in my mind as kind of like a metaphor almost, or a symbol for the moment of him introducing trail running. And when I wrote the article, I looked around nationally. I went to a guy who is sort of the country's ultra running expert, who has a podcast and writes a bunch of articles. I talked to some folks in Colorado, talked to some publishers of different websites and whatnot, and no one could really come up with someone on a par and as early as Chris. The closest they could come, that anyone could come really, and it doesn't mean, Tad, you make a very good point, which I was kind of remiss in mentioning in the article. We could talk about that later, but that those people may well have been there, but they weren't fortunate enough, if that's the phrase, to have a father, writing an article for a journal and saving it for posterity.
Yeah.
But as far as the research shows and the record, the only guy who comes at all close was this guy who's considered the father of Colorado trail running, Rick Trujillo,
Yeah.
who did these runs. And I'm sure you know his name from Colorado.
Yeah.
5-time winner of Pikes Peak, and he was on a cross country team at University of Colorado and would run in the woods and up the mountains on the side just for fun. And he is considered sort of the father, but he comes 10 years after Chris.
Right.
Yeah, so Chris was very early. He had these techniques that we associate with contemporary trail running. And then, Tad, I want to sort of get your take on all this. And, why don't I pause here? And then I'd like to talk about what really is amazing for me, which are his actual times and what he accomplished in August 1958.
Yeah. Where to start? I think probably one of the interesting aspects of the development of trail running in New England, at least, was it's the public perception of running. I've described this to you, Doug, before, that when I was running, which was in the early 70s through the early 90s. That was about the time. And I got started running not because I was a runner, but because I wanted to go places that would ordinarily require an overnight. And just because of my work schedule, I didn't have time to do that. And so I started running. And then, found that was a lot of fun. And so started doing it for its own sake. And then by the time the 90s came around, I'd broken enough of my body and I wasn't really functional anymore. But during that time, I ran in New Hampshire, and I ran in the Pacific Northwest when we lived there. I ran for a little while in Colorado, but by that time my knees were really starting to give me trouble. So I did a few things in the Boulder area, but not really a lot. But in the early 70s, when I started running, most of the people that I would encounter on the trail would get angry at me. It was it's unimaginable today, where this has become, as I said the other day in an email, this is multi-billion-dollar business. Everybody knows about trail running now. You see it all the time. But in the early 70s, it was like I was, I was being unsafe. It was somehow disrespectful to the mountains. I was spoiling their epic or something like that. But that was a very, very common reaction. I saw it all the time. And you know, people would say, you know, why don't you slow down and enjoy what you're doing? Or you're not going to be running very long. things, things like that. It says something about what people um, expect you to enjoy in the mountains and how to enjoy it. You know, the idea that if you were running, you couldn't be paying attention or enjoying, you know, what was around you. To me, when it was, you know, if you're really feeling in shape and running well, it was almost like being able to fly over the terrain. You saw everything in a different way because you could cover a lot of ground very fast, and it gave you this sort of 1,000-foot view that you couldn't get if you were, you know, moving along under a big pack. So in that sense, it really increased my perception or enjoyment of what was around me. Um,
I
at
think
some point, I'd like to describe a few of the runs that I did very briefly. I don't know if this is the time to do it or not, but uh,
sure, sure. Do you want to
yeah,
do it? And by the way, I would just like to follow up on one quick thought that's still true today. Two of the top runners in the world right now, two of the top, you know, women runners, you know, Hillary Girardi and Katie Scheid, both come from the White Mountains. Hillary just won a race here in Chamonix, a 90-kilometer race with about 22,000 feet of climbing. And both of them, you know, we're all good friends here. And the two of them say, they started trail running in the White Mountains, but they didn't call it trail running. All they really wanted to do was get quickly between the huts.
yeah,
You know, and then suddenly they were over here, you know, doing very, very well in races, realizing that what they were doing in the White Mountains, and they might not have had a name for it, prepared them very well. And the White Mountains is one of the best training grounds in the world for technical trail running.
yeah,
Um,
it really
so,
is.
so Tad, it'd be really cool to hear about some of your runs, and then I'd like to talk about what Chris did and put that in some modern, you know, perspective, maybe.
Yeah. Um, so I um, I was never particularly fast. Um, I just loved doing it, and um, this is mostly in the northern presidentials because I lived in Randolph. Um, Here's one run that was a real favorite of mine. These were all done in the ones I'm going to show you early mid '80s, and unfortunately, my records are all out in Colorado, so I don't actually have my times in them. But this is one that is informally called the up down up down up down, um, of running up and down routes around Mount Washington. So let me get let's see, I've got a little thing here. Can you see my mouse moving around on the?
This
Oh,
looks
wait a
good
minute.
here.
Here's what I want. Here's what I want. There we go. Okay. So Pinkham here. Here's the summit of Washington. So the blue is up. I started from Pinkham one morning, went up Boot Spur to Lakes, then down the Amanuset Ravine to the bottom of the Cog, up the Jewel Trail onto the Gulf side, just south of Clay, and then up a little out of the screen here to the Sphinx Trail, and then down the Sphinx Trail into the bottom of the Gulfs of the Great Gulf, and then up the Great Gulf Trail to the summit of Washington and down Lions Head. I think this took about 8 hours, something like that. And the fun or the amusing part about this one is that when I got to the bottom, there happened to be a woman there who worked for the AMC, who was conducting a survey on what people were doing. So as I came into Pinkham, she's got this little picnic, little table set up by the trail as you come into the teepee, and she says, "So, where did you go today?"
Yeah. How
I
much
was
time do you
able to
have?
tell her a good story. Another one that was a great favorite of mine is this one, which I think of as the power bar traverse. Now, why is this? That's not the right size. Let me. I'm going to stop sharing this one and see if I can do this a little bit better. Let's see. I'm going to just open it up. And we'll have to look at it this way. So,
Tad, what era was this?
this was early mid 80s. And another thing another interesting feature of this that you and I have talked about in the past is the evolution of shoes.
Right.
This is right when trail shoes were starting to come into existence. There were things like the very famous Nike Waffle Trainer, which was the first running shoe that had a lug sole that would actually stick to anything on a trail with poor footing. And I went through many different pairs of shoes over the years, none of which were actually designed for trail running because that wasn't a thing yet. That was an interesting part of all this. This was a run that I did. My wife might remember this because she drove me down to Bartlett in the morning, and I ran from Bartlett up to Randolph, and I wanted to take a line that went as straight through the White Mountains as possible. Through the Northern Presidential. So rather than doing a presidential traverse, which would have started over here and gone over Eisenhower and so forth, I went down to the very bottom on the Mount Auburn Ridge and went up that ridge and then joined the Davis Path up around Mount Pleasant and on to the summit of Washington and then on north. The interesting thing about this one was that this was when power bars first came into vogue, and the food that I carried with me consisted of 4 power bars, and these are the original epoxy power bars. And what I discovered was that I ran for an hour or two or something and started to feel myself fading a little bit. So I ate a power bar and I felt fine, and I went for an hour and crashed. So I ate another power bar. I went for another hour and crashed. And by this time, the power bars were not tasting very good. And so I ate a half a power bar and I went for half an hour and crashed. And so I was starting to get a little bit worried. I also had a little bit of money with me. When I got to the summit of Washington, I bought a hot dog and a cup of coffee, and I put about a dozen of those little creamers into it. And on the basis of that, the cruise from Mount Washington on home was so good that I just floated across the northern peaks down to Crag, stopped, had a cup of coffee at Crag, and then went down. And when I got to the highway, I just kept right on going up the road. I didn't even bother to call for a ride. And I got home, and my wife, Ann, and Joanna Finney were sitting in the kitchen, and they had a steak and fresh peas for supper.
So you had the steak that, Chris.
That Chris would have had.
Of course, now we understand that protein should come immediately after your run, ideally, right? I was trying to show, by the way, that I have an entire drawer here of, when you're part of the trail running industrial complex, as I am now, you get all this junk for free. And I have, and now we have, no shortage of thousands of different things with names like Scratch and UCAN and Tailwind and Noon and Moon Valley and on and on and on and on and on and on, which Chris didn't benefit from.
Right.
I wanted to, if we could, talk a little bit about what Chris actually did in 1 month. That might be, this is now what, more than 20 years before you, Tad.
Yep.
So
I'm going to get a better map up here that we can use to share. Take me a minute.
Yeah, that would be great to see. And I think we all sort of like have our own adventures that we've created. But what Chris did, in my mind anyway, in August 1958, at the end of one of his RMC trail crew summers, was if it hadn't been documented as thoroughly as it was, I would have been, I think my first reaction would have been deep suspicion. It's unbelievable. And just to sort of go through some of the numbers here, he started that summer off by cycling from Cambridge, Massachusetts on a bike that he had modified up to, and I have the numbers here, let's see. Uh, um, anyway, he cycled in about 16 hours. No, I'm sorry, that's his. Okay, 170 miles in 16 and a half hours on a 3-speed bike that he modified, leaving at 3:30 in the morning in Cambridge. I mean, that's astounding as a start. He also benefited going into that season from coaching at Phillips Exeter, or a coach who taught him about pacing and what we now call negative splits, like going faster in the second half of your run. So he really had a certain amount of knowledge going in. He had a strong trail crew season. And then at the end of the first season, or at the end of that 1958 season, on August 14th, he had just turned 20. He took hours off of Burt Malcolm's time, from which had stood for 22 years. He took hours off the Hutz Traverse, off the Prezi Traverse time. I'm sorry, Hutz Traverse, doing it in 16 hours and 41 minutes. Now, that's the current record is only slightly better. Well, it's a few hours better than that, but that's 60 years later. The women's record is just a few hours faster by Katie Scheid, and that's on a route that's 5 miles shorter. So it's a little bit of apples and oranges. Chris included Pinkham in that. So he started off with that. No one actually ever beat that course record. Tom Deans, along with Chuck Kellogg, who was later in the Olympics, tried and dropped on a very hot day. I have a quote here somewhere in the article from Tom Deans. Here it is. Chris was exceptional, totally committed, a singular figure doing these treks at incredible speeds. So, word had gotten out around the Hut system about this guy from Randolph at that point. And Chris followed that up. So he right after the season, first came the Prezi Traverse, 4 hours, 35 minutes. Now the record now is just 53 minutes faster. Now, Chris actually thought that wasn't fast enough. So only 2 days later, after doing that, he did his famous 4 laps on Mount Adams. In the trail running world, that's kind of legendary. It was 13 hours and 56 minutes, each time faster than the one before. And showing that he was pacing himself really well. It's 18,072 feet. And what that led to was something that's still going on today. There's a very well-known ultra runner who used to live in New England and is now in the Northwest, Jeff List, who is a very, very much admired. Jeff was a big a big fan of Chris and his approach and his records. And he started something called the Adams Vertical Day, which in June every year trail runners get together. It's an informal thing. It's intentionally not promoted to keep it low key and simple, which is probably why you haven't heard about it, or if you have, maybe it's from me. And Jeff has done a very good job of keeping it simple and low key. But some of the best runners in New England get together and try to beat what Chris did. And it was only a few years ago that finally happened. so he shattered the Huts record that summer. He shattered the Prezi Traverse record, and then he went on at the end of the summer to set a time on the Mahoosuc Traverse that wasn't until about now maybe 5 or 6 years ago that it was beaten, and it wasn't for lack of trying. And the two people who beat that record, Ben Nephew and Ryan Welts, from the article, they actually taped Chris's times to a water bottle that that Ben had with him, and they had about 6 or 8 splits from that Fast and Far article, and they said the entire way until Gentian Pond, they were within a minute of Chris's times, and they were going as fast as they could. And Chris stopped for a steak at Gentian Pond, and that's where they put something like 10 minutes on him, which they, maintained all the way to the finish, and therefore, broke the record. So what Chris accomplished in that summer, that 1 month in August 1958, I think is maybe, I mean, this is risky stuff to say, but it may be like unparalleled in the US in terms of accomplishments for speed in the mountains, as far as we can tell. It was flat out astounding. These times today are still very, very, very fast and would be, notable. And he did it without the benefit of all the stuff we have today, which is just, in my mind, makes him an absolutely exceptional figure. So
not only without the benefit of the shoes, the nutrition, the knowledge about training, and so forth, he did it without a target to try to exceed by some increment.
yeah,
That's the thing which is so amazing to me about Chris and a handful of other athletes, is these people that it's like, in the climbing world, people have been able to climb it at higher and higher levels, but it's been very, very incremental, where somebody works out something that's just a little bit better, a little bit more difficult than what came before. And Chris was not that. Chris went and just went completely beyond. Of course, he didn't have many milestones to aim for, but his just completely without reference to what had happened before, set these records, which is really extraordinary to me.
There's some trying to get at what motivated Chris and how he was so successful. Like I've thought a lot about this. In one way I thought I'd get at this is just by sharing some of the quotes from people I talked to that are, some of these are in the article. Obviously, Lydia was really helpful, his widow. Some of these are from her. One is from the editor that came after him of the Appalachian Journal. Anyway, she said he chose what he wanted to do and he did it well. Like, so there's a real focus that he had, and he really thought through how he was going to accomplish this. All of his records, he had people, strategically positioned. He had specific asks of them. I mean, these days, we would call those, aid stations, and you'd have a crew. I mean, that's maybe another way Chris was sort of pioneering. He knew exactly what he wanted. He knew exactly where he wanted people and what they were going to do for him. Lydia also said he had a true desire to be a real explorer, to go where people had not been before. And I think that is not necessarily just a physical desire to go to a place, but maybe to, push and challenge oneself to try to accomplish things that hadn't been accomplished before. And I think there are aspects of Chris too that I've always found really endearing and very interesting that I think a lot of us can relate to. One of the quotes well, one of the thoughts was that when he was the editor of Appalachia Journal, which he was briefly, he often chose not to identify spots because he was concerned about overuse of those areas. And the editor who came after him said, blank spots on the map meant more to Chris than the accolades that attend discovery and first ascents. To me, that's quite touching, right? I mean, that's putting your ego aside for something greater. Um,
Yeah.
So I think those are some values that I think pulled me to RMC and Randolph, which I think a lot of us share, that I think Chris seemed to have in great quantity. Tad, were you
Yeah.
going to say something?
I was going to add that, he also carried those same values and habits into mountaineering and later into sailing and exploration in boats with Lydia. Um, the Chris's climbs in Alaska when he was at Harvard are also probably as well known as his running. The Harvard Mountaineering Club ascent to the Wickersham Wall in on Denali is really is sort of equally amazing and also boundary breaking, a real leap ahead of what other people were doing. I've always had the private idea that a lot of what got those guys up the routes that they did was the notion that being from Harvard, that this was simply going to happen. It was fated. But after he left the mountains and he and Lydia started exploring, particularly the coast of Labrador, in a small sailboat, that's something where he really didn't record much of anything. But every summer for a number of years, apparently they were out there exploring the coast, climbing peaks that are unnamed and unidentified.
And, some of those are in, I don't know if we can use those images that I sent, but Lydia sent me some photos of Chris climbing and sailing. But Tad, I wanted to ask you a question. One of the things I came across in the interviews I did, and I maybe did about a dozen interviews, primarily with Randolph people of his generation, trying to sort of, and I'm going to write another article about Chris for the Appalachia Journal for this next year, focusing more on kind of the scene in Randolph a little bit. And one of the things that interests me that I'd like to ask you about, Tad, is, obviously Chris was physically exceptional, mentally, tough and determined, and had a singular focus, and all those things came together to make him, an exceptional person and an exceptional professor in his short time at MIT before he passed away. And I want to talk a little bit about what I learned about that as well, which was kind of, I would say, bothersome and tragic. What was it? I heard a lot from people from that era about how Randolph was so different than it is today. And people, I think it was Judy Hudson, maybe. There were some others who would say that at age 10 or 12, they would just head off, and they would, they'd say, I'm going up to Madison for the night, and that there was this sense of adventure and exploration and challenge that started very young, which we really don't see today. What's your sense of that time in Randolph?
Well, first
I
of
know
all,
it was a generation before.
yeah, it really was a lot different. One of the most important differences was that the character of the summer vacation at that time. Randolph was one of a large number of communities where people who had extended summer vacations, and these were primarily academics and clergy, would come to a place that was, the focal point was typically a lake or mountains, something like that, and could spend extended periods there. So that when I came up as a child in the summer, we'd spend a month or 6 weeks or, possibly even 2 months. My father would have to go up and down periodically for work, but the rest of the family were able to stay here, and that was true for almost everybody. So we had the same group of people that came back year after year, and there would be these cohorts of kids that would grow up together in Randolph. So we knew the place very well. We knew the people very well, and I think that gave parents a much more, a greater sense of security that their kids could go out and do things in a setting with people that everybody knew. Of course, also, at that time, I think there was a much greater tendency, just culturally, to let your kids do what they wanted to do than today. But certainly true that kids would go out and they'd go up to Crag for the night, and Crag and Grey Knob were big social scenes when I was there in the 60s and 70s, where kids were up and down constantly, and we would do all kinds of things very much on the spur of the moment. But a large part of it was simply because we had the time. We were here for, the whole summer. It's not like we had, a week or 10 days, which is mostly what it's like now. One of the other results of that, or consequent. Yeah, Guy, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. Am I allowed to talk?
Yeah, absolutely. Jump right in.
I'm late because I flunked another test. My third time I flunked a COVID test. The other thing was, I don't know how to describe it, but those are the days that I grew up in, the 50s and the 60s. And Tad's absolutely right. I mean, you go up the mountain at the spur of a moment. I think part of it also was because you could do it. It was more open. You didn't have to worry about running into a million people up there. But in the 2 summers I was a caretaker, Tad's right. It was a parade of kids from Randolph, families from Randolph coming through. As Tad said, I used to come up for 8 weeks, spend most of my summer. Dad was at MIT. We were up here all summer long. You had a group of friends. You just, spur of the moment, you did things, and it was available. You could do it and not have to worry about a billion people.
Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads.
That culture definitely contributed to the creation of what Chris pulled off. And I don't know, Guy, did you cross paths with Chris much at all?
Absolutely, but I was an annoying little puke at the time. I mean, that was one thing that happened that was really, looking back at it, it was kind of funny. But I mean, we all have it. Our younger brothers and sisters, we're the annoying little pukes in our lives, and it's really funny because a lot of people are now my friends. I was at a meeting with one of my dear friends and colleagues in the Randolph Foundation, Sarah Gallup, who at one point in my life was an annoying little puke. But yes, I knew Chris, but only as a much younger kid looking up to him. So I didn't cross paths an awful lot with him, but I knew of him and, was at places where he was. And he really was a remarkable man.
I think one of the other things, when Chris left Randolph, I'm not sure exactly when that was, but I don't think he really came back. It was like, Randolph was done, and then he was off to do all these other things that he did. He lived until 76 or 77, I think. And he was, throughout the 60s and 70s, I don't think he was here much.
Yeah, I didn't find much about that. He passed away. I'm just looking at the article here, but he passed. He went into a coma on November 16th, 1977. Died and passed away 5 days later. And for those of you who don't know the story, I mean, this is one of the really, really, really sad parts of the story for me, maybe the only really sad part, is that, you know, Chris was a rising star at MIT. He very quickly got an associate professorship. He became, and you know, Lydia told me he was sort of like, when he became sick with headaches, he started frantically, you know, pushing along. Maybe it's not quite the word, but like he really wanted to finish some of his research, and he pretty quickly became one of the country's top experts on the geophysics of the Earth's crust. But what had happened is that he had been asked to, from his physics background at Harvard, where he was undergraduate, he in 1962 had been asked to witness the atomic bomb tests at the, what was, I guess, called the Nevada test site, which is very famous and now, I guess, you know, infamous. And Lydia said about a year later he started having headaches, and it was like, let's see, you know, he always had these periodic severe headaches, and then it was you know, 1977 that he passed away from a brain tumor. She's convinced that they're connected. You know, very reasonable assumption. She did some research in trying to gather the records, and the Army said the records were missing, and they were never able to. There was, I guess, a group of them, of people who had had cancer coming out of those tests, and they were never able to gather together the Army records of who had been where when. So we lost Chris at age 38. You know, in 1977. You know, I came to Randolph 10 years later, and stuck around a few years after that. And, you know, I think it's, I mean, obviously it's just like a tragic loss in so many ways. You know, such a wonderful guy with such great values and such great, obviously an incredible scientist as well. So that was a really, I'd say, one of the really sad parts of the story to, you know, discover, you know, for me. You know, but on the flip side, you could say that by 38, you know, he had accomplished, you know, several times more than most of us will accomplish in a lifetime. So there's that.
Yeah, do you know when did Klaus and Erica stop coming to Randolph? Do you know? Do you remember?
Oh boy. No, but I'll bet somebody else.
I'm just wondering if
will
there's
be
a
able-
correlation
able
between
to remember.
when he stopped coming to Randolph is when his parents got old. That's just pure wonder.
Oh no, because no, it was before that, because Klaus was still leading the singing.
That he still does in my
So-
dreams.
Yeah, right.
I can't get it out.
Somebody remind me, but I mean, Bill Menifee took over from Klaus, as I recall, and it was
Al
not very long.
Al Hudson did, didn't he?
Oh, here's Bill, Bill and Barbara Arnold. They'll remember.
There he is.
They'll remember.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I've been sitting here listening to this, and it's been really great. And I guess I just like to put in a few things. Can't remember exactly when Klaus or Erica died. I'm sure we could look it up quite easily. But I do. Yeah, Barbara's reminding us after she got here, so that would have been in the early 90s.
Whoa.
Excuse me.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, mid 90s. I do remember the last time I saw Chris, and it must have been in 77. He and his parents, he was here in Randolph, and they were all parked out at the bottom of the Mount Crescent Trail here by our house. And I could see them gathering around as Chris and Lydia and his parents and maybe a couple others. And they were going to hike up Mount Crescent. And I was out there chatting with them all. And Chris obviously wasn't real interested in the conversation. And he had wandered up the road a little bit, just sort of, I didn't pay much attention. And Chris told me how sick, Klaus told me how sick Chris was, and that this was probably going to be his last hike, and they were going to go up Mount Crescent. And it just sort of hit me all of a sudden, just because I knew Chris, and somewhat, as Guy said, I was a little guy at that time, but in 1958, but I do remember just all the talk that was going around Randolph all that summer about him. But yeah, that was probably I'm sure it was his last hike in Randolph. And I don't believe they even made it all the way up Mount Crescent that day, but it was pretty moving. A memory I do have of him, and it was probably around 1960, 61, somewhere in there. My father and I were up at Craig Camp, and which we did. I was just one of the kids and was up there with my father too. It was a cold, rainy, foggy day, and we weren't sure what we were going to do that day. We got up the day before, and sitting around the wood stove, and Klaus Goetze walked in, and we were sort of, came in, which wasn't all that unusual, but it wasn't a great day to just go for a walk either. So, we wondered what he was doing. We got chatting about all things, and finally came out that his son Chris was on the trail behind him, bringing up a load of plastic water pipe. And that at that time, this plastic pipe that we all use now was all brand new. And it's probably almost an hour later before Chris finally got there. And Chris was really never known for packing heavy loads that a lot of us did later on. But he had it's all just going on my memory, but he had 3 large coils of plastic pipe on his pack, probably 3/4 inch pipe. And obviously it worked very hard. And then it came out that at some point he decided it would have been easier if he just unhooked one coil from his pack and unrolled it. So it rolled all the way down the trail. It's probably at least 100-foot roll. And so it'd be easier if he just pulled that along behind him on the trail instead of having to carry it. And of course that didn't work real well because it got snagged on the trees and the rocks. And then he had to coil it all the way back up again, tie it to his backboard and keep on going. But even then, I can remember I was probably 11 going on 12 years old. I was like, who is this guy? And this is pretty impressive. But I can remember, do you remember, Tad, or either one of you, what year he did the Wickersham Wall? It was probably 58, 59, somewhere in there.
I think it was.
And I think you also have one of those photos of that pack load of I think that.
Oh yeah.
Doug shared one of those photos with you.
That's right. There was a picture of that. It was hanging around up at Craig for years. But I think he was carrying that pipe in that photo I'm thinking of. But it might have been the Gorgon.
That picture.
That photo may have been taken that day, Bill, presumably like at the bottom of the trail.
That could well have been. Yeah.
We've used that in the RMC newsletter a few times. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
The Wickersham Wall. So 58, Chris had finished his freshman year at Harvard. So I don't know when the Wickersham Wall was, but I'm guessing a year or two after that. Easy enough to find out online.
I guess it should be pointed out that not only did he do it, I'm not sure who he was with, but obviously probably not alone. But he made all of his own equipment, tent, sleeping bags, clothing. That was all stuff that he did. He wanted to make sure it was right. And he made all of his equipment. That's just the kind of thing he would do.
63.
63. Yeah. So that would have been the same. That's right then. Yeah, that'd been the same summer I was working up at Craig Camp. And that, of course, then again, that everybody in Randolph was buzzing about it. And he was actually Brad Washburn, who became quite famous for his knowledge of McKinley and various other peaks around the world, was very much in touch with Chris's parents, Klaus and Erica, on Chris's progress and how he was doing and so on and forth. He was sort of the touchstone for all the information on Chris's climb for the whole town. So yeah, good memories of him. He was more my sister's age, but I was in touch.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Bill. Like I have a lot of sort of facts about Chris, but from that period, and have details of his trail running in particular. Of course, it's of interest to me. But what was he like in that era as a kid? I mean, how do you remember him? I'm just curious as a person,
Well, he of course at that age a few years makes a big difference. So he hung out more with my sister's gang. She's
Right.
5 years older than I am, so he would have been, older by a few years. Yeah, Linda Cross, as I think you
Mhm.
mentioned,
Yeah.
part of that gang. But I remember him as being pretty soft spoken, certainly not a braggart by any means.
No, not at all.
He was so grumpy that day that he got into Craig after trying to pull the pipe up the mountain, which I
That's
could
adorable.
understand.
Mm.
But as I recall, he got there, he sat down, had something to eat, and rested a little bit, and then it was decided we were all going to go out and hook up the pipe, which meant unrolling all the way from that spring halfway between Craig and Grey Knob over to Craig Camp, and then getting the water running and the cold and the wet. And of course, I was a little guy helping out and having a great time. But yeah, he waited a little bit and he was ready to go again. But he was pretty soft spoken. Obviously he was strong and a bull of a man, but
That's very much what I remember. The
yeah.
few occasions that I met him. I remember I was at a Christmas party one time at the Goetze's house in Cambridge. It was very famous because they had real candles on their Christmas tree. It was this beautiful place. Both Klaus and Erica were music teachers, and they had two grand pianos nested in this big living room. And I was trying to get Chris to tell me about the Wickersham Wall ascent, and he really didn't want to go into it. I think in part because he was so modest, in part because that was something that he'd done 10 years before, and it was kind of behind him, and he just wasn't that interested anymore.
It was interesting to hear, and I know you spoke of it too, Tad, that his sailing days later on, with Lydia, but also with his daughters, they went sailing. They'd spend their summers sailing, as you said, up around Newfoundland and Labrador, and actually kept their boat in Nova Scotia, not far from where our land is now. But it was not only two of them, but they'd go out with their daughters and just be sailing around all summer long, pull into a little inlet someplace and spend a few days and then move along. And yeah, we had some pretty good talks with Lydia about that. She actually gave us some maps of the area that she had from those times.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote, I mean, this is not distributed, but she gave me a copy. She wrote essentially a book for Liesl, and I forget her other daughter's name, but
Erica.
Okay.
Yeah. Barbara's helping me with that.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Barb. Yeah, she wrote a really interesting, essentially like a self-published book about Chris for them. That has a lot of that, Bill. And boy, I mean, I'm focusing on the stuff of interest to me, but when you look at Chris holistically, like you see this sort of Renaissance guy, made his own gear, and they built a boat together and sailed in it and did a first descent on Denali that's still deeply admired, and set these trail running records. And was an incredible MIT professor by age 38. But it just sounds like he just really applied himself to stuff in a quiet, kind of an understated way. Is that, or I mean, maybe hard to know as a kid, but yeah.
So
the other thing I remember, and Bill and Tad, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but because this may just be an addled old brain memory, but I remember Chris having a smile.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And he had a very warm smile.
Yeah, that was. I think that was his default expression.
Hello.
Hang on. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember that smile as being, as you said, Tad, sort of a default expression that it was a warm look.
Yep.
It made it so he felt like you could talk to him.
Yeah. So Klaus died in 1995. And
95.
Also for the climbers among us, he was on Denali with Hank Abrams, Rick Millikan, Pete Carman, John Graham, Don Jensen, and Dave Roberts.
Interesting.
Of course, Dave Roberts went on to, he's a very well-known climbing writer.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, he's a English professor at Bard. Is it Bard? Well, anyway, yeah, it was a number of those. Pete Carmen and Don Jensen went on to do a lot of other, and Rick Milliken too, went on to do.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Dad. Did you say 95 or 85?
95.
95. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I wanted to just follow up on a question Jenny had here, which is when were Vibram Souls introduced? Someone other than me knows the answer to that, but I did want to sort of put in perspective a little bit. I've got here trail running shoes. I mean, this is Chamonix, and everybody it comes with residency here is trail running shoes to test. But I have new trail running shoes from the North Face that have carbon fiber inside under the sole. I have a pair of shoes from this company La Sportiva that have what's called the BOA system that for some reason we apparently need to replace shoelaces. So they have this circular system for tightening your shoelace and for releasing it. Like you may have seen them on ski boots. I mean, the technology now is, flat out ridiculous from my point of view. And Chris was doing all of this with gear that he made. I asked Brian Underhill and he described the gear that they used. And I think it's in the article, but it's very, very simple stuff. And this was before trail running shoes. I mean, just, sneakers that were probably made in Berlin at the Converse factory,
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible, when you think about this. So, but I don't know, anyone know when Vibrams came along?
This is very interesting.
That's a good question. As far as I know, they were always there. I can remember as a youth running around the mountains as Guy was talking and up and down the crag and all that. But boy, it wasn't probably till I got my first job at Craig Camp at 16. My parents weren't going to buy me hiking boots.
I know the answer to this question. My original answer was going to be, well, my first pair of limbers had them in 1960. So,
yeah.
I think they were an early adopter of them.
They go longer than that. They were created in 1935.
Really?
I just Googled it. Yeah. 1930. Hey, everybody else does.
I can just remember that up until I got my job at Craig Camp, my parents said it wasn't worth buying any kind of hiking boots for me because my feet were going too fast and I could damn well just wear sneakers.
You got it.
Yeah. But I didn't really get limbers till a few years after that when I was working for AMC. Yeah.
Yeah, it says that Vibram soles were used by an Italian expedition that the first ascent of K2 in 1954. The first real appearance in practice. I remember when I was a kid, and again, this is when my feet were growing, and my parents weren't going to buy me limbers. But going down to Limmer, I had an old pair of leather boots, and we brought them down there to ask, could they put a Vibram sole on them? And they looked at them and they said, no, that won't work. But here, and he dug out a bag full of old Tricone nails.
Oh yeah.
And I think he gave them to me. He said, here, go to it. Put them on yourself. You just pound them around the rim of the sole.
Well, according to the Google article I was looking at, it was created by an Italian man in 1935. At the time, felt soles were being used by climbers, and 6 of his friends tragically died in a climbing accident, presumably in the winter. Well, I'm not sure of that, but that's when he created the Vibram sole. Yeah. This Italian fellow. That's what one Google source says.
I found some research notes here I just wanted to share about the Wickersham Wall. June 1963, it's the Wickersham is the second largest mountain face in the world. Chris was 23 then, and the oldest member of the expedition. So a little perspective there. Not long, 4 or 5 years after he was off trail crew.
Yeah.
Running around.
These guys had really very little big mountain experience. Their experience was mostly in New England. A few of them had some big mountain experience, but they had pretty long necks.
I also come to learn from living over here a little bit that there is nothing like experience in the White Mountains. The weather here, when people think it's severe, I always think, well, I feel okay. This is like Mount Washington and shoulder season weather. Or when they feel it's technical trail running, I feel like, oh yeah, try running up Great Gully. There's more exposure, but and many more fall you die kind of situations, but. So, and the Wickersham Wall is obviously a different beast, but I'm sure Chris must have picked up skills that, put him in good stead in the Whites.
Well, there's a lot of reason why. There's a lot of good alpine climbers that come from New England. This is a really good place to learn that kind of climbing in the same way that the Pacific Northwest is a big source for high altitude climbers. And there, I think the reason is the easy proximity of peaks like Rainier, where climbers have an opportunity to go to high altitude from sea level. So different, like in Colorado, you can go to 14,000 feet, but you live at 5,000 to 7,000 feet. So it's not that big a change. But in Seattle, you go from sea level. So they get a lot of experience in functioning when they're not acclimatized in the Pacific Northwest.
Which we can get
in
here
the same
too.
way here in New England, you learn how to function when it's really nasty weather.
Does anyone know if Chris ever did much ice climbing in the White Mountains? Like in Huntington's or places like that?
That wasn't really happening.
Wasn't happening
in the
much.
White Mountains. Yeah, they were still in the days of step cutting.
Right.
There were, I think, occasional ascents of Pinnacle Gully. I don't recall when the first ascent of Pinnacle Gully was, but that kind of ice climbing didn't really start happening until the mid '60s, late '60s. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to see if anyone else had any questions. You can just sort of type it in the chat there.
Or speak
up. It is getting a little late here, so I may want to sort of wind things down. But I don't know. It's interesting to hear, and I'm glad the guy, you and the guy and Bill were here, because it's always interesting to hear different perspectives. And I feel like Chris is sort of like always been someone I've been curious about. I don't claim to be half as fast, but we went to the same high school. We both were interested in RMC trails. Had a lot of time in Randolph, and I feel like his name always kept popping up in different turns. So it was great to get a chance to really write about him, and I'll focus more on Randolph and probably come back to you, Guy and Tad and Bill, for some more stuff for the journal article. I will say, go ahead.
So before you leave, we were talking by email the other day about some of the top runners now. We're talking about Kilian Jornet in particular, and trying to get an estimate of what kind of times he might do on these routes. And I think probably the Hut Traverse is a little bit difficult to guess at, because it's so long and varied that so much of it depends upon weather and other things like that. But like climbing Mount Adams, or the time to Crag, which is a
Yeah.
Yeah.
route that sort of everybody's familiar with.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Doug, you estimated that Kilian Jornet might be able to do the crag route in about 27 minutes.
Yeah, if you extrapolate, so for those of you who haven't heard the name, Kilian is widely considered the world's best all-around trail runner. And he's also a pretty hardcore mountaineer. He's got the speed record on Mount Everest. He has here in town here, he went up and down Mont Blanc from the church in town to the summit and down in 4 hours and 50 some odd minutes, which is just impossible to even understand. And so he has one of the world's fastest times for what's called a vertical kilometer, which is running 1,000 meters uphill, 3,280 feet, I guess, or no, 3,000, yeah,
3,300 feet.
3,300 feet, and in under 5 kilometers, and that's rough. And his time there is under 30 minutes. So, and I always figured in Randolph that was like running from Route 2 to Crag and then going up to Knight's Castle, something about like that.
Yeah.
And so extrapolating, you could see Kilian running to Crag in about 27 minutes. That was my best guess.
Yeah. And I wondered if it might be if the footing on the spur trail might slow anybody down a bit. But on the other hand, the start of it going up the Amphibrack or shortline spur, shortline Randolph path, you can really streak up those, and I'm sure that he would be really cleaning
The
up
putting
on
on
the
the
first part
spurt
of it.
trail, I always thought was more of a problem coming down than it was going up.
Yeah.
But there, in the 2 years I worked at Crag, I don't think I made it up to Crag in under 27 hours. I was not an uphill guy. I was a downhill guy. My best time was 21 minutes. What does anybody know? Did Chris have a record time down from Randolph, or a time from Randolph?
A record time where?
From Crag back down.
No, I couldn't find any time from Crag to Randolph up or down for him.
Yeah.
So unfortunately we don't have that to compare to.
Well, he's always carrying those water pipes.
Yeah. Or trying to avoid them on the ground.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any idea of what any kind of fastest known time for the route to Crag?
Well, it has to be in the 20s.
Okay,
I
I think
I don't know. Coming down, I'm talking. Going
I'm
up.
talking about going up.
Coming down. I thought it was Johnny's. I'm sorry, Jenny. Go ahead.
going up, I think Curtis Moore was 35.
I think Jordan Cargill did it somewhere between 30 and 35 too.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would
makes sense.
35. Yeah, 35 would sound about right to me. I mean, 30 would be world class.
Yeah.
But it's kind of funny over here because the White Mountain crowd, whenever a record is set in the White Mountains, or a couple of times now I've gotten an email saying, what do you think Kilian would do this time in? With people hoping, I think, that they would be close to it. And the honest truth is he has a record of obliterating, kind of much like Chris did with those before him. Kilian's times are just astronomically faster than other people's times on technical terrain. So I think going up to Crag wouldn't even begin to face him. He's usually doing more technically demanding stuff like that in situations where you cannot slip. So I mean, I've climbed over some of the routes that he's trail run, and they're, from my point of view, terrifying.
I hope he doesn't end up like Uli Steck.
Yeah.
Sometimes these guys don't know when to quit.
No, it's a concern. Yeah.
Before we break up and before Howie leaves, I want to just show one more route that I am particularly proud of. And that is, I'm trying to share my screen here. Hopefully this will show up in just a moment. Yeah, here we go. Okay, well, it's a little bit the wrong size, but this is from the fairly early days of mountain biking. And I had my first mountain bike, and I was having a fair amount of fun with it. Although, like any sensible person, I eventually figured out that if you're on a trail, it makes a whole lot more sense to run than to try to ride a bicycle. But anyway, I had this bicycle and I had this great idea. I'm going to leave Randolph. I'm going to ride down the Jefferson Notch Road to the base of the Cog Railway. Then I'll carry my bicycle up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail, and I'll ride down the auto road, and then I'll go home through Gorham. It's got this very elegant, cast to it. So I ride down to the base of the Cog. I start up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail. So I've got to answer, about 50 questions from people about why am I carrying a bicycle up the Ammonoosuc Ravine Trail? But I do that. I get to the summit of Washington. I go inside, get a cup of tea, and it's really, really dense fog, visibility of about 6 feet. And I come out, and there are a couple of auto road guys standing by my bicycle and saying, "How'd you get this bicycle up here?" I said, "Oh, I carried it up Ammonoosuc Ravine." I said, "Oh, how are you going down?" "So I'm going to ride down the auto road." He said, "No, you're not. This is a private road. We don't allow bicycles."
I knew that was coming.
And yeah,
What,
and
what
there were a
year is
couple of
this?
early 90s, I think, something like that. And there were a couple of auto road vans there, and I think they figured they were going to get, a quick $50 taking me down. I said, "Well, okay." So I picked up my bicycle and I carried it down through Tuckerman's. So then I had to answer about 500 questions about why are you carrying your bicycle down Mount Washington? And by the time I got to pick him, I said, "I've had it," and I called and I got a ride home. So, but I have carried a bicycle to the summit of Mount Washington.
Ted, you just lost a lot of cachet in my opinion. I thought you were going to tell me you rode down the Tucker Trail.
Yeah, I should have done that. I did. I considered once I got down to the Tuck Trail, below Hermit Lake.
Yeah, well, you can do that.
But it's just so full of baby heads, and I didn't have suspension or anything. If I had a big, modern dual suspension mountain bike, then sure, but I wouldn't have been able to carry it up.
Well, Tad, for what it's worth, you do have one record that will stay forever in the record books.
The garbage record?
Well, no, I mean carrying your mountain bike up and
that.
down Washington.
Yeah. Right.
I assume, but you never know.
Well, there's an old lawnmower on Monticello lawn on Jefferson.
That's right. I'm afraid that's long gone, but I remember that from years ago. Yeah.
Been a lot of strange junk that's been carried up.
Well, guys, thanks a lot for giving me the chance to talk about a favorite topic of mine. It's
Thank
nice
you.
to-
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you guys are considering continuing this series and perhaps considering packing records to the various AMC and RMC hubs. I thought of it when you were talking earlier about how Chris had to pace himself and for more long distance running, but certainly packing is along the same lines. You can easily just burn out first.
Yeah.
Are we talking the real packing record or the ones that sort of appeared out of people's minds?
That would all have to be sorted out.
The time John, was it John? Bill, you remember John or Chris Campbell came on with was it 3 loads of tar paper and convinced Freeman he lugged up 3 rolls of tar paper.
Yeah.
I remember that. I think that was Chris.
I think the truth was that they had carried up 3 rolls, but they did it one at a time and hid 2 of them in the bushes just below the cap.
Right below.
Showed up with all 3. Yeah.
He made it about 50 feet with 3 rolls on.
Yeah.
Freeman thought
Freeman was impressed. Yeah.
Freeman was impressed.
Yeah. It was hard to impress Freeman.
Thank you, Jenny, or whoever else did this. Thank you so much.
It's great. It's been great.
And,
Well, let's do another one about something. Packing's a good one.
No, we're open to suggestions.
Yeah.
I think Bruce Sloat wrote an article, and I have a feeling it might be in the AMC Old Hutman's Journal a few years ago about packing, or it might have been in Appalachia. I'm not sure, or maybe both, but just as a reference.
I have a bunch of people who have like mind here or a similar background. I am willing to pay big money if anybody has a picture taken from the old Crag outhouse, looking up over the Mahoosics.
Feeling they'd all be pretty blurry.
Clean the windows, Bill. I did. That was that was the best view in the world.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I agree. It was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, guys, I need to bow out and go to
Yeah.
sleep here. 11:30.
We want to save some talking points for the next one.
Right.
Jenny, thanks for organizing this. This is
I don't know.
There you go.
Thank you guys for hosting.
it's fun for me to see a bunch of Randolph faces too and hear from folks.
When are you going to be in Randolph next, Doug?
October, November. I actually have a place I can stay now, and so I hope to be around a little bit. So watch out.
Yeah.
So,
We will.
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
Bill, thanks
so-
for the water.
Sure. Is it improving?
I think I haven't heard any complaints, so I'll take that as a
Good.
yes.
No news is good news.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Thank you.
See you next
Bye.
time.